Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my pleasure to serve as director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. We're delighted to have you with us this evening for our third program of the fall season. We've started off on a fast pace. We also not only have strong programs of speakers, journalists, and authors, but also I want to point out, for those of you who haven't been to one of the earlier programs this fall, we have two new exhibits in the lobby. Along the far wall, behind the stairway, is for the first time a timeline of Gerald Ford's life. This library, amazingly, in its 27 years, had never had a comprehensive story about President Ford. So that's a new addition that we just installed in August. And also we have, as is appropriate for the season, a lobby exhibit on campaigns and inaugurations. So you'll want to take a look at that. We are a work in progress, and those of you who have been coming and longtime attendees can tell a little bit difference in lighting. We're not done yet, but this is new backlighting behind me and some new spots along the walls. The audio part of the system isn't done, which is why I'm holding this microphone. But stand by, in a few weeks we'll have finished this project. But this will be a great improvement in this auditorium. Tonight, it's a special honor for me to host one of my 11 colleagues who had presidential libraries across the country. Dr. J. Hakes has served as director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, since the June of 2000. He was formerly a professor of political science at the University of New Orleans and left a tenured position in academia to join the Carter administration in 1977, serving as an assistant secretary of the Interior, working with Cecil Andrus. Jay later worked with the Florida governor and later Senator Bob Graham, where he held numerous positions, including director of the governor's energy office, chief of staff, and director of Senator Graham's Florida office. During most of the 90s, Dr. Hakes headed the highly regarded Energy Information Administration at the U.S. Department of Energy. There he oversaw the collection and dissemination of America's official energy data and analysis and was referred to as the government's chief energy analyst. Jay has testified before congressional committees a mere 26 times, if you can imagine that, and has been frequently quoted in the mainstream press and broadcast media of all types. Jay has timed the production of his new book perfectly. He's been working on this for 5 years, and who but Jay would have timed it for this election season with this financial situation facing our country, and of course with all of us very, very concerned about energy. His new book, A Declaration of Energy Independence, just came out in July. I also want to note the brilliant planning on the part of the Ford Library staff, who have invited Jay to speak right now in Energy Awareness Month, which is October. Please welcome my esteemed colleague from the Carter Library, Dr. Jay Hakes.
Thank you very much, Elaine. One of the real advantages of being a director of a presidential library is you get to work with people like Elaine, and it's always such a great pleasure when the presidential library directors get together, because we all have great stories about our presidents and we swap. The last job that I had before my current job as head of the Energy Information Administration was a very nice job. Analyzing the energy situation in the United States, but you had to be careful what you said, because in those days, because I was sort of the custodian of the government's official data, statements that I made would sometimes be attributed by the press as having moved the price of oil. So they'll say the price of oil went up or down yesterday because Jay Hakes said this. And once I was actually attributed to having moved the stock market. Now, the truth of the matter is, reporters make all this up because nobody knows why the price of oil goes up and down and why the stock market goes up and down. So with that in mind, I sort of would conjecture that the market bounced back today after they learned that tonight I was going to provide a solution to America's energy problems. And if that hadn't happened, the market might have kept going down. Let me say that it's a special privilege to be at the Ford Library. I did a lot of the research for my book here. I believe that you cannot understand current events without understanding past events. When you go back in history, the first White House report on global climate change was released in 1974 when Gerald Ford was president by the White House. So I must say that the archivists here are tremendous to work with. There were a number of people in the Ford administration who kept very good records. Glenn Schlady, Mike Duvall, Brent Scrowcroft, wonderful records to work with. So even if you're not working on a book, I would suggest you find some current topic that you're interested in, and come here and do some research on it. You'll find almost invariably that this issue was being discussed when Gerald Ford was president. The other reason I think it's kind of special this week, when the bailout bill, or maybe you call it the rescue bill or whatever you want to call it, passed, they dumped a lot of things in that bill that got overlooked. And I don't know how much attention it's gotten in the press, but one of the things they dumped into that bill was the mental health parity bill. And it basically is a requirement that by the year 2010, that insurance companies offered by major corporations must provide equal treatment for mental illness as they do for other forms of illness. The two major outside lobbyists on this bill who were most effective with Congress were two women who are well known, but they conspire a lot together about how to get good things done. And it's Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter, who are very good friends. And they have been tirelessly working on this bill for this last couple of years. I know Rosalind Carter monitors it almost by the hour. And so these two women have showed the advantages of working across party aisles. I mean, and who can say no to Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter? So in what is a very, very busy news week, here's a story that was maybe a little bit under the radar, but I think definitely worth mentioning. Now, my topic of energy independence is certainly in the news. If you hear the presidential candidates talking, they're talking about energy independence all the time. I'd like to pull back a little bit from the campaign rhetoric and say that underneath all this debate is a basic principle to which we must pay attention. And this actually was articulated by a gentleman named David Matthews, who was an assistant secretary for health in the Ford administration and is now the president of the Kettering Foundation. And we were on a panel together, I believe in March, about energy. And at the end, he said something that was deceptively simple, but I think worth repeating. He said, the fuels that sustain us are the fuels that endanger us. In other words, we have these oil and coal and natural gas without which our modern civilization could not run. And we're foolish to pretend that they can run without them, at least as we are currently configured. But there's a very high cost of becoming reliant on these fuels, or in the words of President Bush, addicted to oil. And they come in the form of national security concerns. One of the things that I would point to in this area as illustrative of this problem is that if Iran develops nuclear weapons, one of the major things that will make that possible is the high price we pay for oil. Most terrorist operations are at least indirectly financed from money that would only be possible in countries that are getting their revenues from oil. Our biggest challenge in this hemisphere is from Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. His power is financed by oil. On the economic side, you've all seen Boone Pickens. He says that we lose $700 billion a year in our negative energy trade balance. I use the figure over $1 billion a day just because I'm a little more conservative. But that's a lot of money. That's much bigger than our trade deficit with China. It is much, much more expensive than the cost of the war in Iran and Iraq. And I would argue that it would be very difficult for us to maintain our position as a major world economy with that kind of deficit in energy. Then on the environmental side, there are many environmental threats from oil, gas, and coal use, but the major one in my mind is global climate change. Basically, most of the greenhouse gases come from the combustion of fossil fuels. So far, mankind has added about a third to the natural greenhouse gas layer. We're starting to see the effects of that in the Arctic. The effects of this will accelerate and will cause many effects, some of which we'll like, but most of which we will not like. So that's why I say these are fuels that endanger us. Now, my premise is that we've got to look at the history, and that history has a lot of mythology to it. And I believe that many of our presidents have not been accurately understood because we haven't looked at what they did about energy or what the impacts were. But there's a standard line of thought, and I use oil imports as kind of a placeholder for interpreting a lot of things, that we have in 1973 an Arab oil embargo. And the narrative you'll hear is that we refused to recognize that problem, and therefore we did nothing about it, and that's why we have the problem today, and that imports continued to go up. The problem with that is it's not true. After the Arab oil embargo, which basically went from October of 1973 to March of 74, the people in Washington were not total idiots. The Republicans realized and the Democrats realized that something needed to be done about dependence on foreign oil. Richard Nixon, who had created a lot of the mess with his wage and price controls and with government allocation of oil, was part of the problem, but he also was a little bit part of the solution. Richard Nixon was the author of the idea that we should have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and he actually wanted it to be 50 if you go back into the papers. So a lot of people say, well, Jimmy Carter did the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. No, that was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon started the momentum for much higher expenditures in research and development and energy. He started the momentum for more expenditures on mass transit. When Ford came into power, he continued Nixon's emphasis on more money for research and development. He finalized the creation of the Energy Research and Development Administration, and he also supported more mass transit, saying that this was an important way to cut our dependence on foreign oil. But he did a lot more than that, and Ford, in going through the records, it's amazing how many public speeches he gave on television about energy. At cabinet meetings, this was something that he constantly discussed, and he was meeting with the staff all the time about energy. He announced when he got in office, back when he took office, the economy was kind of a mess, and so he put a freeze on government spending, no increases in any area, with one exception. The one exception was energy, because he felt that the United States needed to respond to this threat. Now, the image is that Congress was just stick in the mud obstacle. But in fact, in 1975, in December, the Congress passed what's called the Energy Policy and Conservation Act in 1973, which I think is still arguably today the most important piece of legislation we've ever passed. It was where the auto efficiency standards came from that required that automobile efficiency go from basically 14 miles per gallon to 27.5. This was done in the 1975 Act. Again, a lot of people say, well, Carter brought in the efficiency standards. Well, he worked on the rules, but he didn't pass the legislation. This act also created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Right now in Louisiana, there's 700 million barrels of oil available for emergencies. It doesn't create gasoline or diesel fuel, so when the refineries go out, it doesn't help you very much. But if we're lacking crude oil, we have quite a bit there. That was an initiative in 1975. Now, so here's a major thing that Ford did. But Ford's misfortune was that it takes a while for good policies to take effect. And while Ford was president, the imports kept going up, even though he courageously had promised they would go down. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a political scientist by training. When you pass a law, it takes a year or so to put the regulations in place. And then it takes a while for it to have an impact in the market. So by the time a law starts to have good effects, people forget who passed it. And so Ford has never gotten much credit, and I'm going to return to that issue. Carter passes two major energy packages, one in 1978 and one in 1980. Again, this goes against the common view that Carter was always fighting with Congress that never got anything passed. So by 1980, we had passed three major legislative packages, plus Carter had used the authority under the Ford-passed Act in 75 to start deregulating crude oil prices, which was also helpful. So here's what happened to oil imports. After the Arab oil embargo, they went up till 1977. Then they went down, and then they came up like that. Now that makes all the difference in the world. From 1977 to 1982, oil imports went from 8.6 million barrels a day to 4.3. In other words, oil imports were cut in half. If you prefer to deal with it in percentage terms, in 77 we were importing 47% of our oil, and by 1982 we were down to 28% of our oil was imported. This had a huge impact on our strength in the world. During the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were at war almost entirely during that decade, which greatly reduced oil production in those two countries. Didn't bother us. We'd cut back on our oil usage. Our cars were getting more efficient. We had other alternate sources of energy. Libya bombs a plane. We put a boycott on Libya. We didn't need their oil. If we put a strict international boycott on Iran today, could we stand $200 a barrel oil? We haven't done the prep work at home to be able to assert our influence abroad. We almost destroyed OPEC. OPEC almost went out of business in the early 80s because we had defeated them by reducing our dependence on foreign oil, and OPEC did not regain its world influence till many years later. So if you argue that it starts going down in 77, you could say, well, Carter gets all the credit because it starts going down when Carter's president. But if the prep work hadn't been done by Gerald Ford and the Congress in 75, it wouldn't have started going down in 77. Or you can argue, since it reached its peak under Reagan, that Reagan should get all the credit. But it would not have gone down if Carter hadn't done what he did. So life, in some sense, is unfair. The people who do a lot of the heavy lifting, by the time it bears fruit, people forgot who did it. And even historians don't go back and give proper credit. Now, one of the dilemmas of energy policy that we have to remember is that success in energy policy breeds apathy and complacency. And it's usually when the price of oil is low and supplies are ample that you're in the best position to fill the petroleum reserve or to take other measures. But people don't see why it's important. When people see it's important, they can't do it because supplies are tight. And anyhow, it was clear in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s that we were headed back to even greater dependence on foreign oil than before. But we did not reach the percentage reliance that they had in 1977 until Bill Clinton's second term. That's why this thing here is a total myth. Remember back in late 1998 and early 99 when you could probably buy gasoline around here for about 85 or 90 cents a gallon? Does that seem like a long time ago? Well, that seemed wonderful at the time, but it gave a false sense of security, and it scared the bejesus out of OPEC. OPEC had been a thin shadow of its former self. It had lost the ability to influence the world market. and the price had crashed, and they didn't quite know what to do. And one of their problems was that Venezuela was refusing to accept OPEC quotas. They were inviting in Western oil companies. They were producing as much oil as they wanted. And as long as Venezuela was doing that, one of the founding members of OPEC, it was hard to get the other members to cooperate. But these low prices sent a jolt through OPEC. So they had a meeting in March of 1999 and decided that they were going to come back and get serious about these quotas and cut world oil production to try to bring prices back up. The situation was so dire that Iran and Saudi Arabia decided to cooperate. Now, you may assume that everybody over there is all together, but Iran is Shiite, it's non-Arab. Saudi Arabia is Arab and Sunni. They are bitter rivals. But if gasoline gets down to $12 a barrel, they're going to cooperate. The other thing that happens is that in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez takes over as the head of the country, and he quickly reverses Venezuelan policy to support production cuts among the OPEC members. We originally, when I was at EIA, assumed that OPEC would just continue its normal habits of announcing quotas and not actually following them. So we actually missed what was happening in the world market in 1999 as OPEC slowly began to assert its authority. In December of that year, we noticed a sharp drop in oil inventories, which was an alert that there was a problem somewhere. Now, what else was going on in December of 1999? Remember the Y2K scare? Okay, everything, Oprah was talking about the Y2K scare. And so we thought, well, maybe people are so afraid that there's going to be this calamity on July 1st or New Year's Eve that they're taking oil and storing it someplace where we don't measure it. So that was our theory. But then in January, we figured out that this was more serious and started to warn that inventories were starting to drop and this was going to force up prices. Later, I was confronted by members of the press saying that the Department of Energy had not warned people properly and was the Secretary of Energy at fault? And I said, no. If you're looking for who was at fault, it was probably me. And I explained how we had first thought that OPEC would not be able to enforce discipline on its members. We were wrong about that. And then in December, we were wrong because we thought a Y2K explanation might make sense. And so it wasn't until January that we warned about this. And I said, if you have any doubt that what I'm telling you is the truth, here's the phone numbers of all the technical analysts in our agency, and you can call them up before I can call them and see if we're telling you the same story. So the next day he wrote articles saying, in a burst of candor virtually unknown among federal agencies, Jay Hakes admitted yesterday that the Energy Information Administration had made a mistake. And my employees came running in and they were apologizing. We're so bad, apology for giving you bad advice. And I said, wait a minute, that was a positive story. If you make a mistake, admit you made a mistake, and you have more credibility in the future that people will believe what you say. And I saw that reporter many years later, and he said, I don't know why more people don't learn how to do that. But anyhow, by the spring of that year, Bill Richardson, the Secretary of Energy, and I went over to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to try to convince them to produce more oil. And that was one of the few types of those trips that actually they did agree to do it. So for the rest of 2000, I don't know if they were doing it because the election was coming up or what, but they did increase their production. But then since that time, OPEC has basically had control of the world market. And what's happened, and I think they have been fairly amazed by this, was at least in the initial years, there was no market reaction. Americans sort of kept increasing their oil use in the midst of historically unprecedented prices. The reason I think that was the case is that oil expenditures as a percentage of personal disposable income has become lower. So if a person wants to continue driving up to a certain point, they can. The other thing is that countries like China and many other countries around the world subsidize oil to the consumer. They actually sell it below market price. So you don't have a market feedback there. In Tom Friedman's new book, which when you finish my book you probably want to read, just been out a week or two, but he makes the point, I forget what the multiple is, but I think the Indonesians spend something like 3 or 4 times as much subsidizing oil to consumers as they spend on education. This goes on in many places around the world, and so again, that mutes a market response. There also was no policy response until late in 2007. So here's OPEC jacking up the price, no market response, no policy response from the US, until we get above $3. Then you get above $3 or maybe $3.50, and you start to see market responses. People change their car buying habits to some extent. You start to see some evidence of carpooling. And in last year, Congress passed the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Almost totally ignored the most important piece of energy legislation since 1980, and arguably the most important piece of energy legislation since 1975. It basically took the mileage efficiency standards for SUVs, Hummers, and cars and lumped them all together. The current average is 25 miles per gallon, at least according to the way the Department of Transportation measures it, which is somewhat questionable. And by 2020, that now has to be 35 miles per gallon. So we're going from 25 to 35, a pretty major change. There are also very heroic requirements for biofuels. Unfortunately, a lot of that's for corn-based ethanol, which I'm not a big fan of, but there are also requirements in there for other forms of ethanol that are more beneficial. And then a third part of it that has been overlooked is tight new requirements for appliance efficiency and lighting efficiency. And so that by 2015, the old incandescent light bulb, the workhorse since Edison, is basically outlawed in the American market. It'll sort of be like cigarettes. Well, actually, it'd be harder to buy than cigarettes. So that's a major piece of legislation, and as so often the case, it's been totally under the radar screen. But it is a useful first step towards starting to address some of these problems. So I've taken the authority on myself to deem 2007 as the end of the era of energy complacency, because now we are doing something. We've not done everything we need to do, but at least we're getting started. So I basically say from 82 to 2006 was the age of energy complacency. Now with the higher prices and even in Atlanta now, we have gas lines. Over half the stations still don't have gasoline. So that, but it's such a busy news week that no one pays any attention. There's a lot going on right now. Okay, now my publisher, if I'd had my druthers, I would have just written a book of history, but my publisher felt strongly that I should give prescriptive advice for how to deal with this. He says, well, if you don't know what to do, we're in deep doo-doo. So I did agree to write 7 chapters at the end. And let me just tell you, for instance, what I would do about the automobile. That's only part of the problem, but it's certainly a major part of the problem. First, I would recognize that we've already made some progress with what the Congress had done. It's interesting. You go on the blogosphere, and very educated people will say, well, we ought to outlaw the incandescent light bulb, and we ought to raise the CAFE standards, and be totally oblivious to the fact that Congress actually did that last year. So what I would do is, rather than go up a mile per year in efficiency, I would go up at least 1.5 miles. That way you could go from 25 to 40 in 10 years. And the reason I say you could do that is we have the new efficient diesels coming on the market, which are 10% more efficient, or 30% more efficient. The hybrid technology is still a fairly nascent technology, lots of room for improvement and expansion. There's so many ways that the automobile can be tweaked. If we're willing to downsize our fleet a little bit, and we decide this is truly a national emergency, I think we could probably do 2 miles per year, but in the political environment in which we live, 1.5 miles is probably about as good as we could do. So if you did that sort of in perpetuity, you could be, so you'd be at 40 in 2020, and you could be at 55 by 2030. That would be very significant. Another option is the electric vehicle. You could plug in at night. It takes a while for a battery to recharge, a couple hours, so you probably would want to do it at night. And that just happens to be the time when the electric grid is underutilized, so you wouldn't have to build any new electric plants to handle that load on the system. Right now, the cost of electric fuel would be much less than the price of gasoline. Now, the problem is we don't have a commercial vehicle on the road yet. And General Motors is really backing off on what they say this car can be produced for. They're up now to about $40,000 for this car, and they started off in the mid-20s. Toyota is also bringing one to market in 2010. So we'll have to see what those cars are like. I also have some doubts about the impacts on global climate change. There are 2 laboratory studies that have been done by reputable groups that say it's good for climate change. I've sort of dissected those studies and argue they weren't done very carefully, and I don't accept them as being definitive. So I think that's an open question. But it is another option that's out there for us. But I think if we can move to more advanced forms of ethanol, which would be from things like waste products like the bagasse from sugarcane, pine chips that are available in Georgia, switchgrass, which is almost like a weed. It doesn't require water and tilling the way that corn does. We could move into advanced ethanol. It's not on the market yet. Plants are being built. If these plants are successful, that's the direction we need to go. There is another option. I tend to be known as a little bit of a debunker of new technologies because I've seen them come and go, and I've heard all the wow stories, and then the technology never comes to market. But there is one technology out there that I think has the technology to be the game changer, and that is the fuel from algae. Algae is the most effective processor of the sun. It grows fast. There are many kinds of algae. A lot of work has been done on what are the best types. It turns out that the type in the swimming pool is one of the types that's most effective for fuel, is just by coincidence. But they're not going to come to your house and pick it up. But there are a number of advantages to algae. One is that it requires carbon dioxide, the major greenhouse gas, so you could put it next to a coal plant and absorb the carbon dioxide. Also, it can be easily utilized for the whole range of fuels. Most ethanol right now is for gasoline, and we have limited options for biodiesel, and we need more diesel fuel. And the principal crop used for that in the United States is soybeans, which is not really the best way to produce diesel. So algae can be used to make gasoline, it can be used to make diesel, and it can be used to make jet fuel. And I had some military people on my talk at Arizona State a couple weeks ago, and I said, you know, the military ought to really take over the research on algae fuels because you can make jet fuel on it. You can make the Air Force get them entirely off of the world oil supply. And they usually have a fairly good research budget there, so they could probably handle that. Now, before I leave algae, let me go back to the period of energy complacency. In 1998, the federal government decided to terminate its algae fuels program. And there are about 5 places in the book where I opine future generations will ask, what were those people possibly thinking? So we are behind the curve of where we could have been on algae. Fortunately, we have 3 major oil companies, BP, Chevron, and Shell, that are doing serious work on algae. And a number of states and state universities are doing research on algae. And now there's starting to be a lot of private investment. But if you just do 1 layer algae growing, you get 15 times as much oil per acre as you get from soybeans. But they're not going to do 1 layer. The new digesters that they have are like 15 layers, and they have light that magnifies the sunlight, and they can go great guns. Now, these are not in commercial production yet. And you have to be a little bit skeptical of everything that's not yet in commercial production. But we ought to be willing to pay more for this because of the national security, environmental, and economic benefits. And one thing I like about it is we have to, when we think about technology, we got to think, can China use this technology? And for countries that have limited capital, although I'm not sure I put China in that category right now, they can build open pond technology with low capital investments and produce algae that way. There's some problems with evaporation and other things, but that will work. In other countries that have more capital, where land is more valuable, they'll want to use this 15-layer system. The capital cost will be higher. But it can go in a number of different directions. And we actually need for it to go in that direction. And let me just mention one thing here before I switch topics a little bit. The two presidential candidates have both called for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050 from 50 to 80%. Okay. That's pretty revolutionary. That's what scientists are saying is necessary to avoid much more calamitous effects from climate change than we're seeing today. So if you take that seriously, and I think the scientific consensus is quite strong, then there's going to have to be some mechanisms like the ones I've been talking about to not just make little tweaking kinds of changes, but to make major changes that allow us to continue with a style of life that we enjoy, but aren't doing business as usual. Now, before we turn to questions, I want to return to another question that might have some special relevance to this audience, and I think reflects the challenge that the next president is going to face. The question is, why doesn't Gerald Ford get more credit for what he did in energy? Well, there's not a simple answer to that. But if you look at the four major energy packages that have been passed in history, 75, 78, 80, 2007, there's a familiar pattern. One is that in the course of passing this legislation, it was very, very messy. And there was a lot of negative press about why aren't they doing this quicker? Why aren't they doing this? Why can't they get along? And that process goes on for a long time. And then for a day or two, they pass the bill. And it gets covered for a day or two. So there's been 30 or 40 stories about they haven't passed the bill yet. And then there's 2 or 3 stories that they passed the bill. So people don't end up having fond memories. In the 75 bill, Tip O'Neill, who was a strong supporter of the bill, said this is the most parochial issue that has ever hit the floor of the House. The Washington Post editorial congratulated the Congress for passing the bill, but really couldn't explain why they were for it. Ford himself, within a day or two of his eventual decision to sign the bill, was having speeches drafted both to veto the bill and to sign the bill. He was very torn. William Simon, who was his Treasury Secretary, thought it was the worst thing that Ford ever did was signing that bill. Ford, when he signed the bill, had a 2-minute signing ceremony. And at the end, the press said, is this bill a White House bill or a congressional bill? And Ford just walked out of the room. He was torn about the bill himself. And he was under a lot of attack from the free market people that he had allowed price controls to go on. If he had vetoed the bill, the price controls would have ended cold turkey. So there's one reason, that just the optics of the passage of legislation doesn't reflect what really happened. Second, these bills don't take impact for many years, as I suggested earlier. So when we had the gas crisis this summer, Congress has done nothing about this. Well, they did something about it last December. but it's not going to change the market in 4 or 5 months. The market doesn't work that way. You have to put the rules in place. They start in 2010. They phase it up a little bit each year, and a person doesn't buy a new car every year. So this thing will still be changing behaviors in 2030, even if it's not updated. So there is a time lag. And I go back to a statement by George Shultz. George Shultz is a very wise man who was a staff economist in the Eisenhower administration, went back to the University of Chicago where he was dean of the business school, came in with Nixon where he was the Secretary of Labor, then he was the budget director, then he was the Treasury Secretary, came back as Reagan's Secretary of State. And Shultz says in his memoirs that the economists realize that the effects of government policy are not felt until many years after they are adopted. But what's the poor politician to do who's up for re-election in 2 years? And that is a fundamental problem for politicians, because they can't solve the problem right away. They can usually do things that look like they're solving the problem and make it worse, but people don't have patience. Imagine a politician that got up and said, well, we did do something about this last year. Did you hear anybody say that? No, because they would have been accused of ignoring the problem. Now, Ford contributed to this problem somewhat himself, because Ford lived in a party that was undergoing changes. And therefore, in later years, you didn't want to brag that you had passed CAFE standards. That didn't fit the new Reagan Republican Party. And you could see even this in the presidential debates. In the presidential debates in 1976, energy was not a big issue. But Carter accused Ford of not having an energy policy, which was not true. We had adopted an energy policy. It wasn't complete or comprehensive, but it was pretty good. But Ford didn't really come back and answer that question very well in the debates, because again, his own party was kind of conflicted whether these were good things to do or not. And so the record has been not gotten its due. The other thing I would mention is that people have fuzzy memories. And I worked in the Carter administration, and I've learned from my personal experience and my experience doing historical research that I would not rely on my memory for anything. If there was a written record, I would want to go back and check it. And fortunately for the Ford administration, it's very well documented here at the Ford Library. And as I mentioned earlier, there were a number of people in the government who kept good notes. They're well preserved. You get almost transcripts of meetings, all the debates back and forth. But there is a tendency by historians and other people to rely too much on oral history. And you have somebody trying to remember what happened 30 or 40 years ago. And it's overtaken by all sorts of things to justify current positions. And it's a little bit like the fish story. It tends to kind of grow. And I don't want to pick on any individual, but one of the great people of the Ford administration was a fellow named Frank Zarb. And Zarb was the head of the Federal Energy Administration. He replaced John Sawhill after he was dumped because he got at odds with several of the prominent cabinet members. And Zarb was doing all the hard work on this legislation. And he represented Ford before the Congress, and he was the one that eventually convinced Ford to sign the bill. And Frank Zarb wrote an op-ed in the New York Times last year, and he was talking about current energy policy. And he said, well, under Ford, we passed the legislation that required the mileage efficiency stickers to be placed in the windows of automobiles. Well, that was done by Nixon before the Arab oil embargo. What Ford did was he passed the mandated requirements on Detroit to produce more fuel-efficient cars. And maybe there was a tendency to think in the current version of how people think about regulation that wasn't such a good thing. But here's, if there was one person I would rely on to have that information correct, it would be Frank Zarb, and he had it wrong. And it makes all the difference in the world, because if you don't understand that, you don't understand that dip there that occurred. And my argument is we're all a bunch of wimps today if we can't do that. You know, you hear a lot of people saying, well, you know, these are things we ought to do, but you're kind of naive to suggest that we could make a major change in the American trend line like greenhouse gas emissions or oil import dependence. I don't know why that's that difficult. It's difficult to do politically. And so one of the arguments I close with is we may need politicians who are willing to lose elections, or we may need an electorate that's able to look at things in a broader historical way. And I would say that historians generally don't help them as much as they could, partly because many historians are not trained in economics, and therefore it's hard for them to analyze economic trends, which underlie so much of this. So that is my basic argument, and I'm sticking to it unless I hear new evidence tonight or a persuasive argument that convinces me that I've overlooked something. But I think it would, I suspect for this type of question that you, or this type of issue that you will have questions or comments. I'm prepared to talk about any of the energy technologies that are being considered today or any historical issues you want to raise. Yes?
I wonder if you could set me straight. I am puzzled about something that happened in this administration with Cheney meeting with certain energy people, and I'm wondering who they are. Nobody's supposed to know because it's secret. And what impact has that had on our current policy regarding all of these things that you speak of?
Yeah. Well, it became quite a cause célèbre early in President Bush's first term about this meeting, the meetings they had to prepare the president's energy policy. And I think we have enough evidence that he met with oil industry executives, but did not meet with environmental groups and people of that sort. I mean, we know enough about it. My own view is that the Bush program ought to be viewed mainly on the substance of the program, what they came up with. I do sort of care who they meet with, but I more care with what it is. You know, for instance, President Bush came up with the idea that we should measure greenhouse gas emissions as a percentage of the economy. So if the economy goes up 3% a year and greenhouse gases go up 1% a year, we've cut greenhouse gas emissions in his formulation. Well, to me, that doesn't work, you know, because you actually have to cut them. But Cheney is an interesting fellow. I mean, if you take someone like a David Gergen, who worked very closely with Cheney when he worked for Ford, Cheney was very admired in the Ford administration. It was interesting because at that time, Rumsfeld was sort of viewed as the bad cop, and Cheney was viewed as the good cop. Everybody liked Cheney. But people like Gergen feel that Cheney's time at Halliburton, being a CEO, somewhat changed his view of the world. And he obviously had a lot of influence. And one of the things that he did that bothered me was when he mocked conservation. Because this, if you look at energy, the cheapest and quickest results that you can get are not from alternate energy sources, they're from conservation and efficiency. And so that sent a terrible message, I think, to the American people about what direction we were headed in. Now, I will say that for those of you who are, everything is more nuanced than it seems. And I would argue that the Bush of the last 2 years, President Bush, is different from the Bush of the first 6 years. And as my evidence, I would say that the beginning of 1970s, of the beginning of 2007, he actually proposed increases in the CAFE standards. He also accepted the findings of the fourth assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Global Climate Change and signed a high-impact bill, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which I don't think he would have signed 2 years earlier. So there has been a considerable amount of moderation in the Bush position, but I think that part of that moderation may reflect the fact that Cheney doesn't have the influence he had the first 6 years.
Your feelings on nuclear power?
Nuclear power is necessary, in my opinion, to meet these ambitious reduction goals for greenhouse gas emissions. If you just crunch the numbers of what was going to happen with greenhouse gas emissions and the various strategies we will have to use, I don't know how you get there without nuclear. The only way you could possibly get there without nuclear, in my opinion, is if we perfect the technology where you can gasify the coal, separate out the carbon dioxide, re-inject it, and probably pipe it back to some reservoir in Texas. My view is that the nuclear technology is closer to being ready than the coal. Now, that being said, nuclear is very expensive. And if someone tells you nuclear is the cheapest form of power, it ain't. The cost of building a nuclear plant is very high. If the interest rate goes up, it gets higher. There's a shortage of steel and concrete right now around the world. So the idea that you can just sort of plunk down, 30 new nuclear plants, I don't know if the market can handle that. But I do think if we close the door to nuclear, that we're sort of declaring defeat on the climate change issue, and we're going to have to do it. What I propose in the book is that we move to deeper injection of the high-level waste. Right now, they're at Yucca Mountain. I'm sort of torn on Yucca Mountain out in Nevada. I've generally supported disposal there, but there is some threat to the water, contamination of the water underground. And if you go down deeper into crystalline rock, you remove those concerns. That will make it more expensive. It's another expense, but I just think to get the public comfortable with this, that's what we're going to have to do. And we've got to have it ready there as a technology. The barrier to nuclear is not government regulation right now. It's getting Wall Street to finance the plants. The government is actually going to subsidize the first few nuclear plants that are built. Yeah.
Along the same lines, the reserves of uranium, where do they stand? And like my understanding is that supply is limited, so we'll sustain nuclear for some period of time before you maybe have to go to breeder reactors. And I'm wondering your thoughts on the nuclear proliferation issue.
Well, this is the more difficult question. I mean, if you want to see something that's sort of a fairly definitive study on this, MIT a couple years ago did a study on the future of the nuclear industry, and it's available at the MIT website. And you can get their viewpoint. They feel that we can still continue to do what's called a once-through cycle, use the radium and dispose of it. And we don't have any short-term need to reprocess, including the breeder reactor. Now, this was a very controversial subject in the 1970s. It was actually Ford who stopped the reprocessing program. He actually stopped, over Kissinger's suggestion, giving all this technology to the Shah of Iran. And he put a slowdown onto the breeder reactor. And then Carter was not against the breeder reactor in theory, but he felt that the breeder technology they were using was not what was needed, so he wanted to put it back into a research phase rather than a development stage. And we probably should have done that. We probably should have been doing research on the breeder reactor all these years, but we haven't, so we're stuck with the old breeder technology. But that is an issue, and we keep hoping that science will find some better way to reprocess without the nuclear proliferation issue. But right now, my position is the once-through cycle. But as you suggest, there's going to be a point at which we're going to have to readdress that issue. Okay.
Will you give your opinion on fuel cell technology?
Fuel cell technology. Well, that's a very interesting case because this was touted by President Bush as his major technology. And I originally thought that there were just a few things that were new, and that was one of them. But as I did my research, I found it's a very old technology. And I remember going through the Nixon files, I think it was in 1970 or 71, and he was invited to a demonstration of fuel cells back in the early 70s. Fuel cells are run on hydrogen. And hydrogen appears to be clean because it just separates into water. But hydrogen has a lot of problems. One is hydrogen is not a fuel. It's like a battery. It stores energy. So you have to make the hydrogen somewhere, usually with the same either nuclear power or solar power or coal power or something. So it's not clean all the way through the cycle. Then you have to transport it by pipeline, and it's very diffuse. It's not a dense fuel. So you'd have to put in a whole new hydrogen fuel transportation system. And so my argument is that you would find it since you've got to have some place producing the power anyway, it's easier to do it with electric lines and batteries than it is with hydrogen. So I don't see hydrogen as something that's going to play a big role in the next 10 or 20 years. Maybe someday it might, but you have to compress it so much, and you're going to have these big tanks in the cars. It's just got a lot, to me, going against it. And I think battery technology, now that we see the need for advanced batteries for cars, I think you're going to see some of the same development that you've seen with batteries for laptops, for instance. So if that progresses on the course that I believe it will, I see the electric car as being the better option. But either case, I don't want hydrogen made from coal, and I don't want electric powering cars coming from coal if it can be avoided, because for climate change reasons, that would be going in the wrong direction. Okay.
You haven't mentioned about wind, solar, and wave energy, and I'm wondering at what cost of oil those become competitive with oil.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to be wary of those estimates. Kissinger always used to make fun of the fact that he would be told that a technology would be competitive when oil got to be $20 per gallon or a barrel, and then $40 per barrel. Wave energy, my gut feeling is not going to be something that's going to be used anytime soon, because the huge capital cost of having to build some sort of structure that could absorb the wave power and not break down. I mean, these are huge forces. Wind and solar, I think what the government needs to do is make the fossil fuels pay for their external costs. This was a term economists used a lot when Ford was president. It says basically the cost you pay at the pump doesn't reflect the cost of keeping the Sixth Fleet in the Persian Gulf. It doesn't reflect the damage that the carbon dioxide is doing to the environment. So to me, my preference would be to make the fossil fuels pay their external costs, and then let these other fuels compete against each other. Both solar and wind suffer from the fact that they are intermittent forms of power. However, Pickens is correct to say that wind could play a much greater role in our system, and what it would do is displace natural gas consumption, which would be a good thing. So I was very disappointed that last year's legislation didn't include the renewable portfolio standard, which would have required more use of renewable energy. Solar is less ready right now to be cost effective than wind, but it's also a more immature technology. And in this sense, immature is good, because what that means in the minds of the technical experts is it's got more room for improvement. So there's a lot of exciting solar research going on out there. One of the concerns about solar is it takes a lot of land. That's why one of the approaches is to put it on your roof. So I think solar is going to be out there. But I do think if we use, often in solar, when if you have a solar house or something, or you're using solar in Africa where you don't have a transmission line, you've got to downsize your energy use a little bit. You maybe have to have a smaller refrigerator, or you've got to design your house so it doesn't need quite so much air conditioning. So how we use solar may require some other design modifications in our housing and appliances to go with it. Again, if we have really good batteries, we could save the energy from the sun and the wind. That would help. But I wouldn't want to, I think we need to expand our use of all of those, but I wouldn't rely on that alone, because it's intermittent, and I don't think it can sustain our economy at its current levels. Yes?
Well, you spoke of conservation as necessary, and we have energy standards for automobiles, national standards. Why don't we have national standards for our buildings? We are dumping a lot of energy through our buildings. Energy standards here in Michigan are terrible. We just built a new home, and we are heating, cooling, and providing hot water for that home for 15 cents per square foot per year.
Yep.
And yes, we have solar hot water.
Yeah. That is a big weakness right now in U.S. energy policy. The government has done a fair to middling job of regulating major appliances. For instance, we've seen for refrigerators remarkable increases in efficiency that have been mandated by the government. We've seen the same for air conditioners, water heaters. You can also get tax credits if you want to do tankless water heating. Buildings are a huge consumer of energy, commercial and residential. But one of the problems about national regulation is weather conditions change so much that what you would mandate in Michigan would be pretty different than what you would mandate in Georgia. So this has generally been considered more of a state responsibility. So if it's a state responsibility, there are two things that you need. One is you need a strong housing code, and second, you need to enforce that code. And I have been trying to convince the Congress and the foundations and all sorts of people to finance a good study of housing code compliance around the country, because I think what they'll find is that even the states that have good energy codes, they're not being enforced. But right now, this issue is being swept under the rug. But I don't think you could pass a national standard for housing that would cover all the different climates. You'd have to do it at least in broad regions, and I'd rather see the states do it. But when I meet with state officials, I say this is your main responsibility. The federal government's going to worry about the automobile. They're going to worry about the appliance efficiency standards. So you as state officials need to be worrying about this. So you need codes, and then you also need financial systems where maybe your utility is paid to earn a profit on saving energy in a building as much as building a new power plant, so that there's some economic incentive to come in behind and retrofit older structures and things like that that might not be covered by a new building code.
North America is very rich in deposits of natural gas. What is going on in the pricing of natural gas?
Well, I mean, I think there's an open question about how rich we are. It's like oil. I mean, the easy natural gas and the easy oil has basically been found. And in recent years, there's been some drop-off in natural gas production, which has been reversed in the last few years with a number of technologies. But one is they can go down now into shale rock, and they use high-pressure water to force up the natural gas. So I think there is some good prospect that natural gas supplies will increase. But I think, again, I can't always explain why prices go up and down, and not just to be modest, but I don't think anybody else can either. But to sort of take a stab at this, one is that the electric utilities have been building new plants to burn natural gas rather than coal. So that tends to put more demand on the natural gas system. Also, the price of natural gas will flow generally in the same direction as oil prices, because although there's only a few places where people can switch back and forth, there are some places. So the natural gas price is not going to be oblivious to the oil price. That being said, I'm somewhat mystified by it, because if you look at the stocks of natural gas, at no point in the last 5 years have those stocks been particularly low, which you would assume would be a factor in driving up the price. So the answer to your question is I don't totally know the answer to that question. It would just seem on basic supply and demand dynamics that the price would be somewhat lower than it is right now. But if the price of oil goes down, I think it's quite likely the price of natural gas will go down. Where's the microphone? I'm going to wherever the microphone is.
The subject of your book is energy independence, but you link that quite strongly to environmental use of energy and global warming and the like. And I agree that those are important issues, but the question is, are they truly linked, energy independence for our country and the environment?
Okay. Let me tell you a couple reasons why I think they're linked. One is, right now, every industrialized nation in the world, except one, has signed the Kyoto Treaty. There's only one nation. That's us. And we're number 2 in emissions to China with a much smaller population. And we in Canada have by far the largest per capita. And one of my arguments is that we will not be able to exercise leadership in the world in the future if we're the outlier on that issue. Even if climate change is not true, which I think the science is right. We're not going to be able to be the crusader for democracy around the world, for free markets, for all these things, if we're the outlier on climate change. So that's one reason why I think it's hooked to our national security. Second, one of the impacts of global climate change is the dehydration of soils. And in nations where there's a lot of mobility, this problem is masked to some extent. But if you go to low-lying areas of Bangladesh, well, really their issue is more flooding. But if you go to, say, Africa and areas that are on the edge of a desert, that land is likely to have more the growing desert. So you go to Darfur today, one of the issues there is that the amount of arable land is being reduced in size, which is causing fights over that land. So my other argument, and I don't think this is too much of a stretch, is that if we're losing arable land around the world, or the arable land is moving, we're going to have to be involved in more international police operations to prevent genocide, to stop civil wars, and things like that. Our military is going to get involved. Also, the reason is if you're going to have a strategy for reducing oil dependence, it would make sense to pick the strategies that are also going to help you for climate change, just as a matter of policy and economic efficiency. In some cases, for instance, if you were to liquefy coal and burn it in your car, that would be wonderful for oil dependency, but it would be terrible for the environment. So I think there's a book called Gusher of Lies, which tries to he says that he has no position on global climate change. He deals only with the oil import question and concludes that it's not worth worrying about. My argument is you've got to connect all these dots to have reasonable policies. And so in the book, I sort of coined the term, threefers. And basically what I'm talking about is adopting policies that are good for the environment, national security, and the economy. And so I don't share every policy I think is a good policy. I just focus on the ones that I think do all three. So I think there's a lot of linkages there to this. And it's part of just being part of the diplomatic world community in which we live. You know, we were the only, Australia was the only other country that did not sign the Kyoto Treaty, and after the last election, they kicked out the incumbent government, and the first act of the new prime minister was to sign Kyoto. I'm not particularly that big a fan of Kyoto. I agree with Tom Friedman, who says the bigger issue is what we actually do about it rather than whether we sign the treaty, and that ultimately the goal should be for us to show the world what we can do, that we can both deal with the problem and have a thriving economy. When we do that, it's going to be much easier to bring China on board. If it's a treaty commitment where everybody's trying to force everybody else to do it, the dynamics won't be there. And a lot of countries that have signed the Kyoto Treaty have not done a very good job of reducing their emissions.
I think that's a good place for us to pause and thank our speaker. You'll be able to ask him more questions.